So yes, today I've been asked to talk to you about mock circulatory loops for cardiovascular device testing. I'm going to try and transfer as much knowledge as I can to your brains from my brain in half an hour. There is an insane amount of knowledge on mock loops to get through. I'm going to give you the fundamentals. I want you to keep in mind as I'm going through this that not all of it will be related to your specific device, but let's get into it. So my background, did my undergraduate in electronic engineering, and I had no prior biomedical experience before I started working in the field of artificial hearts. For my PhD, I did it on sensors and control of ventricular assist devices, where I was developing fiber optic sensors and control systems for these devices. Oops, that's no good. It's my annotate. Try that one again. So these ones here, if I can get my laser pointer, these are the some of the renders of some of the devices I developed throughout my PhD. My current research background's on cardiorespiratory medicine, so mechanical, circulatory, and respiratory support, AI, smart devices, and clinical interventions. So hopefully this gives me some credibility as to why you might want to listen to what I have to say. I'm directing a team called the ACE Lab, the Advanced Cardiorespiratory Engineering Lab, out of Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane, Australia. Here's a picture of our team. We've got a few more on the team now, and we're a multidisciplinary lab that has mechanical, electrical, and mechatronic engineers. We're in the process of recruiting more materials engineers, and even occasionally we have medical doctors do their research in our lab. So it's a very broad team working on a range of different topics like artificial intelligence, CFD, emergency medicine, smart devices, valvular disease, clinical training, and a few other things. So thinking about medical devices, obviously everyone here is interested in medical devices, otherwise they wouldn't be joining this webinar and on their respective Heart Hack teams. We're going to talk a little bit about the regulatory process before we go into the tools we can use to meet and regulate our devices. So why do we even bother evaluate these devices before putting them in humans? The obvious reason is safety, and safety for patients is a given. That's very obvious. But you also have to consider the safety for your business as well, and in terms of the liability of what occurs if something goes wrong with your device. But perhaps most importantly, the reason we evaluate devices and drugs before putting them in humans is transparency and patient confidence. So imagine if nobody evaluated any devices before they started putting them in people. How would you be able to trust your doctor to know that they are giving you something that is going to help you and not be dangerous? So it's really about ensuring a high level of trust in the healthcare systems we work in. So medical device regulation began in 1938 in America with the FDA. Now we have many bodies, some of which might be applicable to you. So we have the EMA in the EU, TGA in Australia, NMPA in China, and PDMA in Japan. And you will have to get approval from each of these bodies to sell in those respective areas. The function of each body actually varies quite significantly in what kinds of things they're responsible for, but the typical purview of a regulatory body is, of course, to evaluate safety of a device before allowing it to be sold, to evaluate the efficacy of the device and ensure that the therapeutic benefit outweighs its risks, long-term monitoring of the device to ensure that it remains safe and effective over time, even after you've gotten that initial approval, and then quality control to ensure the manufacture of the device or drug is consistent and of high quality. So this is a very simple outline of what a medical device development pathway might look like. You start with ideation and prototyping. You look at a proof of concept and iterative refinement. At some point, you say, this is good enough. Let's start pushing to market and regulating. And then even after you get it to market and even after you put it in patients, you are obligated to do post-market analysis and research. So, these 4 dots may represent more than 20 years of work. Keep that in mind. So what kinds of tools can we use in the development and regulation of our device? And it varies dependent on the device, but oftentimes we use in silico, which includes computational simulations, and you typically can run many thousands of simulations to try and optimize towards your preferred operating point. We also use in vitro testing, which is basically anything that occurs on the benchtop. And this is another place where you can iterate quite cheaply. Once we're pretty close to what we want, we move to in vivo, which is animal trials, and then, of course, clinical trials. And believe it or not, all of these steps can be used as evidence in the regulatory approval pathway. So it's not just about your clinical trials. It's also about showing things like the longevity of your device, its electrical efficiency, its hemolysis in blood loops. There's just so many different bits of evidence that you can submit. So today we're going to, of course, focus on in vitro and mock loops. So some other in vitro models other than mock loops, here is a PIV rig. And basically this is a clear ventricle that's been molded. They seed the ventricle with little reflective particles. They shine a laser onto the particles and induce a flow. And then using a high-speed camera, they can track the movement of the particles and look at the flow dynamics. So that's pretty cool. This is a mechanical heart valve tester, which is used to generate several million cycles of the valve a day to do accelerated aging testing. Of course, in vitro includes anything grown in a petri dish in cell culturing. We can use benchtop blood reservoirs, and then we can use mock loops of various complexity, including things with anatomical and all the way down to very simple left-sided mock loops. Well, what is a mock loop? So essentially, it's a representation of the cardiovascular system. It's really just a bunch of pipes and tubes, but each pipe and tube represents a part of the cardiovascular system and has been specifically chosen and designed to have a certain characteristic. And this is what we call a lumped parameter model, because each one of these little chambers represents hundreds of or possibly thousands of smaller blood vessels. So the advantages of a mock loop is that it's cheap compared to animals, it's highly repeatable, it's highly controllable, and it's very easy to instrument. It's much easier to put more sensors on a mock loop than it is to put more sensors in an animal or human. So we can get actually a lot more data out of these than some of those other models. The disadvantages are that it can't model all of the biological processes. However, there's a lot of research being done in that field. And the model must be always modified for your specific question. Always build and validate your mock loop for the specific question that you want to answer. And we'll talk about that as well later. So the science, what is the Windkessel model? It's basically a mathematical model that models blood flow through the vessels, and it comes in 2, 3, 4, and 5 element variations. I'm showing you here the 5 element variation. So the first element is arterial resistance, which is the resistance to blood flow caused by the arteries. Inertance, which determines how the inertia of the fluid moves through the system, arterial compliance, venous resistance, and venous compliance. So basically what we do is we take a point, we calculate all of the values in here, and then the output of that system is modified by what's going on in here. We'll break each of these down as we go through. And looking at the anatomy of a mock loop. So very quickly, this is sort of a very standard mock loop schematic. You'll see it in many of our papers. This side of the system represents the body and organs, whereas this side of the system represents the lungs. And we'll walk through those as we go. But basically what we have is things coming out of the heart, going into the aorta, coming down through what is represented by the body. The body's using up the imaginary oxygen. The oxygen, deoxygenated blood gets pumped through the right side, back through the lungs, is oxygenated, and returns to the left side of the heart to complete the loop. So as I said, these boxes here are the left and right hearts respectively. And there are a number of components in those hearts. We've got the left atrium mitral valve, left ventricle, aortic valve, right atrium tricuspid valve, right ventricle, and pulmonary valve. And so the first thing we're going to look at here is atrioventricular contraction. And so there are many ways to actually achieve the pumping of the heart. Some methods include pneumatics. Some include things like linear pushers, hydraulics, and there's one more that's going to appear in a minute. So what you can, and rotary. So what you can see here, if I get control of my laser again, on the right-hand side, the nice photo is supposed to be a video of our mock loop pumping up and down. And that one's actually controlled by pneumatics. So essentially what we have is we allow the ventricle to fill up, and then we use a shot of compressed air to push the fluid down, and then the valves control the forward flow through the ventricle. And that's how we create our heartbeat and cardiac output. In some rare instances, you may also want to pulse the atria as well in simulating exercise. So here's this middle one here, you can see has a motor, which is turning rotary motion into linear motion to create displacement in the ventricle. So that's quite nice. In this one on the bottom right corner, we can see that there's a linear stage that actually pistons back and forth, and that pushes fluid into and out of that box with the ventricle in it. And the ventricle will be some sort of silicon system whereby the water, as the water pressure increases inside the box, it actually squeezes that heart and causes it to eject. On the bottom left-hand corner here, we have a system where it's literally just a piston pushing the water in and out. So that's like a pusher plate. And the final one we have in the middle at the bottom is a physiological system where they've actually built different channels inside the heart, and then they inject air in it, and that causes it to beat in a very sort of physiological torsional way, or at least that's the idea. So it's all very well and good to create this water displacement in our ventricle, but if we don't have valves, it's not going to flow in the right direction. So there are a couple of things to consider when picking valves. And the main one is pick a valve with a low pressure drop to avoid simulating aortic stenosis. There are all different kinds of valves. You can see here, this is an umbrella valve where the flow goes in and around the valve when it's open and snapped shut. There are these duckbill valves, which open and close like this. There are check valves, which have a tilting mechanism. There are mechanical bileaflet valves, so many different designs. But the key thing is to make sure that you pick one with a low pressure drop, because otherwise you'll be losing a lot of the work that the heart is doing across the valve, and that energy won't be transferred to the body, and it won't deliver as good blood flow around your mock loop. And indeed, this is exactly what happens for patients with valvular diseases. So unless you're trying to simulate a sick patient, low pressure drop. Here you can see a nice polyurethane valve that we have in our mock loop. It's got about a 3 to 5 millimeter of mercury drop between the left ventricle and the aorta. These old umbrella valves that we had was closer to 15, 20, which is way too high. That another really important component in our Windkessel model and in our mock loop is compliance. So compliance is basically the springiness of the vessels as the blood travels through. And you can feel this in your pulse, right? The thing that you actually feel when you're feeling your pulse is the vessel expanding and contracting due to the changing pressure caused by the ejection of the heart. In some mock loops, and in our mock loop, we actually used a chamber with trapped air, and that air actually acts like a spring. So when the water level rises because of the mock loop's fluid displacement, the air gets compressed and it becomes very springy, and then it wants to push back out, and then that pushes the fluid along, and also works to dampen the waveforms and absorb some of that energy. So this is the actual mathematical definition of compliance. It's the change in volume over the change in pressure. And we can see that the compliance of the arteries is much stiffer compared to that of the veins. And this is the kind of thing you can see in a textbook to look at how compliance in the human works. Now, what you'll notice here is that the compliance is non-linear. And not only is it non-linear, it tends to really, after a point, have this knee bend where the vessels won't stretch anymore. And so you get massive increases in pressure for massive increases in volume, or vice versa. So that kind of makes sense, because if you think about a rubber band, if you stretch it and stretch it and stretch it, it'll feel kind of pretty linear to stretch out. But once you reach that plastic deformation point of that rubber band, it won't stretch anymore, and you'll feel a lot more force until it breaks. And so compliance is really important, because patients with certain diseases have different properties of their compliance, which may actually make them have stiffer compliance. In some cases, they might have lower compliance. And so it's one of those things that is generally very important to include in a mock loop. So as I said, you can use passive compliance chambers using a trapped volume of air, whereby the amount of air you trap in the chamber, so the height, determines the compliance. You want your compliance to be about 1 to 3 for your aorta. And for your pulmonary artery, you want it to be about sort of 2 to 4. And so the way you do this essentially is you allow air into the chamber as you fill it, and then you close the chamber to atmosphere, and then the fluid is non-compressible and the air is compressible. You can also develop compliance chambers with very high compliance in the venous side by actually just leaving the compliance chamber open to atmosphere. And so in this case, the compliance doesn't have a curve, it just has a single value, and that single value is represented by the diameter of the chamber. And the reason for that is that the compliance is determined by the cross-sectional area as well as the height of fluid. Oh, sorry, the density of fluid. So that's what we call a passive compliance chamber. Really easy to build. As you can see here, it's just a pipe either with a cap on it or no cap on it. If you're really interested in sort of aortic or vascular compliance as part of the question that you're investigating, you can actually create more sophisticated compliance chambers, which instead of putting a lid on the top and just sealing it to atmosphere, you can see here, this one has a pipe going in that's injecting air in, and a pipe going out that's allowing air to come out. And so every heartbeat, it's actually physically moving the amount of trapped air, or trapped, you could do it hydraulically as well, to change the stretchiness of the vessel that it's simulating. Here's another one that uses, instead of air, a pusher plate to actively compress and decompress the air trapped inside. So compliance is important. If you don't have the proper compliance in your mock loop, your pressure waveforms will not look right, and your flow will be too high. Another thing to consider is resistance. So obviously the diameter of the vessel is proportional to the amount of blood flow that that vessel will allow. And that diameter is not constant. We know from our compliance already that it changes a little bit as the heart opens, as the heartbeat propagates through the vasculature. But also, your body has a number of autoregulatory mechanisms inside, which changes the default state of relaxation of those vessels. So for instance, when you're exercising, you should undergo some vasodilation, which allows more blood flow to go through your body and deliver more oxygen to your muscles. When you're in a fight or flight mode, for instance, your body will constrict blood flow to your extremities in order to redirect that blood flow to your heart and brain. So there are a number of survival mechanisms that actually cause that resistance to change, and we can modify, or we can simulate that. So in this case, in our mock loop, we use a single SVR and a single PVR to lump all of the pulmonary vascular resistance and all of the systemic vascular resistance. So that's arteries and veins for both sides. And the easiest way to do that is just to use like a ball valve or a gate valve or a tap to change the amount of restriction to blood flow that you have. So the calculation that we use for calculating our resistance is pressure at one end of the system minus pressure at the other end of the system over cardiac output. So that's resistance over pressure drop that we're interested in over cardiac output or flow. And of course, the electrical engineers in the group will recognize that this is just Ohm's law, R equals V on I. So hopefully using this, you can calculate what your resistance is, even without having, just using pressure and flow. The neat thing about this is that you can then feed that into a simple PI controller that you can use to automatically regulate vascular resistance. So here, and this is how we do it, we have a pneumatic line with a pinch valve where the pressure in this system, as it builds up, it causes more restriction, and we can use a simple controller to control the amount of resistance we want to impose on the circuit based on the pressure and flow. What about inertia? Inertia is a tricky one because it's basically controlled by how close things are together. So obviously, when you've got a heart, the chambers are extremely close together. When you start building pipes and gluing them together, you're going to have a number of different, a number of connectors, which is going to make the distance between these chambers move apart. It's frequently really a good idea to keep everything as close together as you're building it to minimize the effect of inertial differences. And this will become really apparent when you're measuring pressures really far away, where you're getting too much pressure drop for what you would expect inside the healthy human. Typically, though, it's not considered so much when building mock loops. It's not a major concern. So there are also advanced features that we can put in our mock loop, a stalling mechanism, for instance, which automatically adjusts cardiac output based on requirements of the body, baroreflex, coronary regulation, cerebral regulation. All of these things are mechanisms that our nervous system and the chemical receptors in our vasculature are automatically doing that we can mathematically model and then impose on our mock loop. And we're going to look at an example of that through the stalling mechanism. And all of these things change based on whether the patient is healthy or in a disease state. So the Frank-Starling mechanism, hopefully some of you are familiar with this, but basically the flow of the heart does not control the flow of blood around the body. The body controls the flow of blood to the heart. So say when you exercise, your vessels dilate because chemical receptors say that my muscles are not getting enough oxygen. That dilation causes more blood flow to deliver more oxygen. This causes more blood flow to return to your heart. The muscles in the heart then stretch further than they would have as the heart fills more. And as they stretch further, they become more tense. And when your heart does then contract, it contracts harder and faster. And that's what we call the Frank-Starling mechanism. And this exists entirely within our ventricles. So your left ventricle and your right ventricle have different Starling mechanisms. The way that we model this in mock loops is we look at volume as an indicator for how hard our heart needs to pump. And we can generate these curves, which you can find in different textbooks, and read, well, if my heart is this full, how much does it need to pump out on the next cardiac cycle? And this is a fixed relationship. So you don't actually even need to use any control system. You just know if it's this full, pump this hard. And then you can find the Starling curve, which represents the kind of patient that you're interested in looking at. So this curve can move up and down based on heart failure, based on emotional state, whether you're in exercise, and so on. So this is a really simple example of how we can measure things and then use the mathematical modeling in the mock loop to replicate certain physiological functions. So we do it pneumatically, as I said, but you could also do this using a linear actuator by measuring how much blood is being returned to the heart, how much pressure is in this box, and then pushing harder. This is something called a pressure volume loop. This is how doctors see the Frank-Starling mechanism, and the mechanism there is represented by this line. So the more full it is here, the further up this line it has to pump. Some final thoughts on actually the physical putting together of the mock loop. Depending on the complexity, you may need pressure sensors, flow sensors, volume sensors, which you can see here, pressure, flow, volume. Your mock loop may need a brain if you want to do those calculations like we saw in the Frank-Starling mechanism. You will need something to read in the values, something to do the calculations, and then output to your actuators to make that, to impose that calculation on the mock loop. So in order of complexity and cost, the DSpace is probably the industry standard for building onto mock loops. If you've got a spare $27,000 sitting around, this is the one you want to get. The next one down is a National Instruments DAC. That can cost you around $15,000 to $16,000 to set up a decent one. A lab jack's less than $1,000. An FPGA ranges from a couple of hundred to $1,000. Microcontrollers range from $30 to $1,000, or $30 to $1,000, and similarly, Raspberry Pis are usually less than $100. Some of the things you should consider when you're picking one of these is, of course, price, but also things like how much electrical resolution do I need from my sensors? How quickly does it need to respond? How many channels does it have that I can actually plug things into and record data from? And one final thing is make sure that you're comfortable programming it and that you have someone in your team that actually knows how to program it. So DSpace uses MATLAB and Simulink. National Instruments and LabJack use LabVIEW, whereas FPGAs, microcontrollers, and Raspberry Pis will use engineering languages like VHDL and C++. Always validate your mock loop. There are a number of ways to validate these, looking at hemodynamics literature, where you can look at waveforms, averages, ranges. If the data isn't published, sometimes you have to go out and collect it yourself. And this is very typical in a PhD when you're looking at something very novel and new. You can actually, if geometry is important to you, you can use PIV, which we talked about already. This is typically done in just a single slice, but you can also get 3D PIV, which is very cool. Whereas if you were interested in, say, developing control systems, your validation might focus around the repeatability and response of your mock loop. So how long does it take to change between two states? What's the overshoot, settling time, repeatability coefficients? You should validate based on what you're specifically looking at. That's good advice for building the mock loop too. Okay, the last slide on mock loops is hybrid mock loops. I just want to touch on this briefly. Hybrid mock loops combine mechanical and numerical elements to reduce hardware and space costs, accurately simulate individual compartments. So at the moment, we've got all of the vessels lumped together in an aortic compliance chamber. But say we wanted to measure just the outflow from the top branches coming out of the aorta, we could do that numerically without having to create complex physical components. Hybrid mock loops are currently the only cost-effective way to simulate oxygen and gas exchange and their effect on the cardiovascular system. They can simulate other biological and auto-regulatory processes, but of course they come with the same limitations as in silico evaluation in terms of computational need, limitations to the physical realm. So, total artificial heart, do I need all of this? The answer is actually a lot of this stuff we've talked about, no. But if I just told you what you needed to build for a mock loop for a total artificial heart, this talk would have been over in like 5 minutes. So, but it also depends on what kind of pump you're developing. So if you're developing a pulsatile flow total artificial heart, you will need most of this. Of course, you won't need the ventricles, atria, you won't need a Frank-Starling mechanism, you won't need valves because that whole heart has been taken out. But the other systems will be really important for making sure that you're getting the correct pressure waveforms coming out of your pump and into the body. Do I need it for a continuous flow TAH? You need even less. So obviously no heart. You probably don't need a sophisticated control system for your mock loop because it's just going to be a bunch of pipes on the bench. Compliance actually won't change the response of your mock loop very much, except when you're changing speed. When you're in a steady state, the compliance actually does nothing. It's just like a capacitor in an electric circuit. It only affects the system when there's a change in state. Resistance, yes, definitely you will need resistance, and you'll also, of course, need pulmonary and systemic circulations with different resistance values to be able to simulate the heart, lungs, and body. Summary and final thoughts. So mock loops are a mechanical representation of the heart and cardiovascular system. Build yours based on your individual test needs and also your product that you're designing. Calibrate, validate, and recalibrate often because these things are a lot of work to maintain. Pay particular attention to validation in the areas you're measuring and, especially around the features that you want your pump to have. Again, if you're looking at control systems, you need to know that your mock loop is responding in the right way and that it's not skewing the data that you're getting out of it. Buy extra of everything because it will break, crack, get damaged, blow up, especially in transit if you're going to bring it to the competition. Consider modularity for travel and how you're going to get it through airport security. And finally, I'd just like to say good luck to your teams. I hope you have fun putting it all together. So this was a super quick overview, and I understand some of these concepts might have gone over your head a little bit. We have a really excellent textbook written by some very handsome editors that covers all of this and more on mechanical, circulatory, and respiratory support. Particularly chapters 25, 26, and 28 talk about preclinical evaluation and regulatory requirements for these kinds of devices. So that's it for me. I think we're pretty well on time. Please let me know if you have any questions. Feel free to email me. Our lab's out at Australia. If you ever want to pay some money to come and spend some time out at our lab, we'll be very happy to host you. Unfortunately, we don't offer any scholarships at the moment.
Awesome. Thank you, Andrew. So what we'll do is we have some pre-submitted questions. We'll ask about 2 of them. And then if you have specific questions, we're going to go into breakout rooms and Andrew will be dropping in and out and you can ask things related to your team then. Madhu, did you want to ask the questions?
So Andrew, like for the mock loop, like what do you they just started with the experimenting the stuffs, right? Like new teams have been jumped in and it's all new to them. Like how do you what advice do you give for them?
What advice? So is the question, what advice do I give to
Beginners, yeah.
somebody brand new starting out to build their mock loop?
Yeah, so
Okay.
there are a lot of new teams joined in this year. So
Yeah.
what's your
Okay. The number one important thing to consider is how are you going to connect your device to your mock loop, and make sure that you can connect it in an easy way that doesn't leak, that doesn't require a lot of tools to put together, especially if you're going to have to bring your mock loop to the competition. So design the rest of your mock loop around your total artificial heart. And that might mean putting some of the connections in the middle and building the mock loop around it. It might mean a number of other design considerations. So do that as your first kind of step in building a mock loop. The second thing I would say is do your calculations. So get as much of it worked out on paper so that you know what diameters do I need? How long do I need to cut the thing? And model it in CAD if you've got the manpower to do so, and have a think about how does it actually all fit together? Because you'd be surprised at how much money you can spend and time you can spend 3D printing or getting parts manufactured, only to realize, well, actually, this thing doesn't fit this thing, or we need an extra screw here or whatever. So really be very detailed in your sort of planning of building the system. And the other really important piece of advice is, depending on your budget, start small and then upgrade it over time. So just get your, in terms of your electronics, in terms of your sensors, start with what you can afford and then build it up over time. Don't necessarily go for the $26,000 system that requires another $80,000 worth of flow meters. Yeah, just don't be discouraged if you're not at that level when you start. Just work on getting some stuff together, get some grants, get some sponsorship, and just keep working on it.
Thanks, Andrew. Any more questions, guys? Camila?
I think we had a few more submitted. I'll just read out one of them, I think, which is really interesting to the teams. So someone asked, how do we correlate CFD results with MCL data to improve design iteration? So I think this question kind of goes to how do we use MCLs in combination with CFD? Or
Yep. Really interesting question. So the step between CFD and mock loops is PIV. And so if you design a PIV rig that's driven by a mock loop, you can get very strong hemodynamically relevant ideas about what your blood flow is going to look like in your pump, for instance, based on your modeling. Now, designing a PIV compatible pump is extremely difficult. And in many cases, the tools are used for different purposes. So a mock loop is mostly used for hemodynamic investigations, so pressure, flow, volume, responsiveness, whereas CFD is mostly used for flow path optimization and reducing hemolysis and reducing thrombosis. So the two tools can be combined. It's a lot of work to do it, but I think definitely keep in mind that what you're trying to achieve may be achievable with just one of those tools and a different method of validation that doesn't require building a whole mock loop or a whole CFD model.